Step out of the car. The words hit like a slap, sharp and commanding, slicing through the calm afternoon. The man in the driver's seat stiffened but obeyed. He kept his hands where they could be seen, fingers trembling slightly against the steering wheel. The polished black sedan he drove gleamed under the sunlight, looking out of place against the rows of suburban houses with neatly trimmed lawns. The officer stood tall, hand resting on his holster. His mirrored sunglasses reflected nothing but authority and suspicion. "What's someone like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" His tone wasn't just cold. It was laced with something heavier, something meant to weigh a man down. The man stepped out slowly, his pressed suit and confident posture at odds with the accusation hanging in the air. He opened his mouth to explain, but the officer cut him off before a single word could form. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't even think about reaching for anything." A small crowd began to gather, neighbors stepping out onto porches, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Eyes peered through curtains, whispers spreading faster than facts. The man felt their stares burning into his back. Judging. Assuming. Condemning. "License and registration," the officer barked. "It's in my jacket," the man replied, steady but cautious. Slowly, the officer snapped. He reached into his jacket, every movement deliberate, but before he could pull out his wallet, the officer grabbed his arm and shoved him hard against the car. The crowd gasped. "What the hell is this about?" the man demanded, his voice finally breaking the composure he had fought so hard to keep. "I'll ask the questions," the officer roared, pushing harder. "Is this car even yours? Or did you steal it?" The accusation struck deep, deeper than the physical force being used. The man bit back, the anger rising in his chest. He knew this wasn't about the car. It wasn't about anything he had done. It was about what he looked like. About how someone like him didn't belong in a place like this, not in their eyes. "Sir, you're making a mistake." The officer leaned in close, his breath hot and sour. "I don't make mistakes." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to resist, to push back, to give the officer the excuse he was looking for. But the man didn't move. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, he looked past the officer, past the crowd, and into the faces of the people watching, people who would go back inside and pretend they hadn't seen anything. Pretend it wasn't their problem. Pretend this wasn't the world they lived in. "Cuff him," the officer ordered, motioning to the backup that had just arrived. The man's heart pounded. He could feel the steel closing around his wrists, locking him into a system designed to break him. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout, to fight back, but then it happened. His wallet fell to the ground as the officer patted him down, the badge tucked neatly inside its leather folds catching the light. The officer froze. The crowd leaned in. And for the first time since the nightmare began, the man saw something crack in the officer's confidence. Fear. "What's this?" the officer muttered, snatching the wallet and flipping it open. His eyes widened. "What the hell is this?" The man straightened. He was no longer the accused. No longer the victim. He was the one in control now, and he let that truth settle between them before he spoke. "I told you you were making a mistake." The officer's face drained of color, and the crowd pressed closer. Murmurs turned into questions. Whispers into accusations. And as the truth unraveled, the balance of power shifted so fast it left everyone reeling. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next, what happened to that officer, left everyone stunned. Careers were destroyed. Lives were changed. And when the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same again. So, what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When justice turns its gaze on the very people sworn to protect it? And what price does a man pay for the prejudice he refuses to let go of? Stay with us. Because this story is just getting started. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We believe in equality, respect, and the power of storytelling to inspire change. If you've ever faced unfair treatment because of the color of your skin, know that your voice matters, your story matters, and you are not alone. This channel is a safe space where we amplify powerful narratives and challenge prejudice. Now, sit back and get ready for a gripping story that will leave you thinking long after it's over. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Enjoy the story. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the quiet suburban streets of Fairview Heights, painting long shadows across rows of pristine houses with white fences and manicured lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood that seemed to hum with security and routine, where neighbors smiled politely from their porches, children rode bikes without worry, and dogs barked lazily behind gates. It was also the kind of place where people noticed when something, or someone, looked out of place. Malcolm Reed knew that all too well. Standing at 6'2", with a lean, athletic frame and skin the color of rich mahogany, he had been taught his whole life to carry himself with confidence, to dress sharp, and to never give anyone a reason to question his presence. But even now, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and stepping out of his sleek black sedan, he could feel the eyes on him. Curious eyes. Suspicious eyes. He adjusted his tie, taking in the stillness of the neighborhood. It wasn't unfamiliar territory. He had spent months investigating a fraud case that stretched through banks and businesses in the area. But today, he wasn't here for work. Today, he was supposed to be celebrating. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac belonged to his college friend, Elijah, a man who had climbed his own ladder of success in finance and recently bought this dream home with his wife. It was the kind of success story that people liked to show off, and Malcolm had no problem letting his friend bask in it. Sliding his sunglasses into his pocket, Malcolm glanced at his reflection in the car window. His sharp jawline and neatly trimmed beard gave him an edge of authority that his years in the FBI had only sharpened. He looked the part of someone who belonged here. But he also knew from experience that looking the part didn't always count for much. Across the street, a police cruiser slowed to a crawl. Malcolm caught sight of the driver, a middle-aged white officer with a square jaw and hard eyes that scanned him with calculated interest. The car lingered just long enough for Malcolm to feel the weight of its presence before it rolled on, disappearing around the corner. He shook it off, reminding himself to stay calm. Inside the house, laughter spilled out through open windows, the sound of people toasting and celebrating echoing through the neighborhood. Malcolm took a steadying breath and reached for the gift bag on the passenger seat. He was halfway to the front door when the police cruiser returned. The officer stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. Malcolm heard the sound before he turned to see the man approaching. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice sharp and direct. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Malcolm blinked, holding back the irritation rising in his chest. "I'm here for a party. My friend lives here. Do you have ID on you?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying the officer. He recognized the type, the squared shoulders, the clipped tone, the way his hand hovered near his holster as if any moment could escalate into something more. "Is there a problem?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice calm. "I'll be the one asking the questions." "Let me see some ID." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had been through this before, too many times to count. It didn't matter what he wore, how he spoke, or what neighborhood he was in. To some people, his presence would always be suspicious. He reached slowly into his jacket, but the officer took a step closer. "Easy. Hands where I can see them." Malcolm froze, his heart pounding harder now. He could feel the heat of the sun on his neck, but it was nothing compared to the heat building inside him, the kind of anger he had been trained to suppress, to control. "Officer, I'm reaching for my wallet." "It's right here." "Keep your hands visible." A few houses down, blinds shifted. Faces peeked out, drawn by the tension crackling in the air. Malcolm knew how this looked, how it always looked. A black man in a nice suit, standing next to an expensive car, being questioned by the police. He could practically feel the judgments forming behind those windows. The officer took another step closer, his voice sharp now. Step away from the vehicle. Malcolm held his ground. Sir, this is a mistake. I'm an invited guest, I said. Step away. The words hit like a command, final and uncompromising. Malcolm knew he had two options, comply or escalate. And he also knew that, for men who looked like him, escalation rarely ended well. He stepped back, raising his hands slightly, even as humiliation burned through him. The officer moved in, his eyes scanning Malcolm's car like he was already convinced of some crime. Is this your car? The officer demanded. Yes, it's mine. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. We'll see about that. The officer motioned for Malcolm to turn around. He hesitated, then did as he was told, placing his hands on the roof of the car. He felt the officer's hands patting him down, rough and impersonal, as though he were nothing more than a suspect. Do you have weapons or drugs on you? Are you serious right now? Malcolm snapped, the anger finally breaking through. The officer's grip on his arm tightened. Watch your tone. This is ridiculous. Look inside my wallet. My ID is in there. I don't need your attitude. Stay still. Malcolm bit his tongue, staring straight ahead at the party still happening inside the house. He wondered if anyone had noticed him outside yet, if anyone would come to his defense. But he knew the answer before the thought had even finished forming. When the officer finally opened Malcolm's wallet, the shift was immediate. His eyes widened, his grip loosening slightly. What's this? Malcolm turned to face him, meeting his gaze with steady confidence. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The officer's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for words. Malcolm didn't let him find them. Now, I think it's time we talk about your mistake. The officer stepped back, suddenly uncertain. Malcolm held his ground, his pulse steady now, his anger controlled but simmering just beneath the surface. And that was when everything changed. What happened next, the fallout, the consequences, would shatter the quiet of Fairview Heights and expose truths no one was ready to face. The officer's hands shook slightly as he stared down at the badge in Malcolm's wallet. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice faltered. Sir, he stopped himself, pressing his lips together as if he was trying to hold back the panic creeping into his expression. Malcolm didn't move. He let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, until the officer's eyes flicked back up to meet his. You've made a mistake, Malcolm said, his tone sharp but controlled. Now, I suggest you let me go before you make this situation any worse for yourself. The officer's mouth opened, then closed again. His hand fell away from his holster, but he didn't step back. Instead, his eyes darted to the growing crowd, to the neighbors whispering and staring from their porches. Malcolm could almost see the wheels turning in his head, calculating whether backing down now would make him look weak. We need to verify your ID, the officer said, his voice tight. Just routine procedure. Routine. Malcolm's voice sharpened. Routine like slamming me against my car. Patting me down. Humiliating me in front of half the neighborhood. The officer's jaw tightened. Let's not escalate this, sir. Escalate. Malcolm took a step forward, his eyes locked on the officer. You think I'm the one escalating? You pulled me out of my car without cause. You searched me without consent. You treated me like a criminal because that's all you saw when you looked at me. Save it. Malcolm's voice dropped, steady but filled with restrained anger. I know exactly what this is. But here's the thing, so do all these people watching. You're not just answering to me anymore. You're answering to them. The officer's eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd again, and Malcolm saw the first crack of doubt deepen. He pressed harder. And when I file my report, you'll be answering to my superiors. Trust me, that's a conversation you don't want to have. The officer took a half step back, but before he could say anything else, another voice cut through the air. What's going on here? Malcolm turned to see Elijah stepping out onto the lawn, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as he took in the scene. He didn't wait for an answer. Malcolm? What the hell is this? Malcolm's shoulders eased slightly, but he didn't let his guard down. He gestured toward the officer. Ask him. Elijah's gaze snapped to the officer, his voice rising. This is my guest. In my house. What exactly are you accusing him of? The officer's face flushed, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step back and muttered something into the radio clip to his shoulder. Backup, Malcolm realized. He's stalling for backup. Malcolm turned back to Elijah. Get your phone. Record everything already on it, Elijah said, pulling out his phone and holding it up. Say cheese. The officer's face went pale. He held up a hand as if that would stop the recording. Sir, I need you to put the phone away. Not happening. Elijah's voice was sharp now, cutting through the tension. You don't get to walk away from this. More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Malcolm could feel the shift. The bystanders weren't just watching anymore. They were engaged. Phones came out, cameras pointed, and the officer's confidence drained by the second. Malcolm stepped closer. You can fix this. Right now. But you need to let me go, and you need to walk away. The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between Malcolm, the crowd, and Elijah's phone. Malcolm could see the conflict in his eyes, the urge to assert control fighting against the growing fear of what would happen if he didn't. Before he could decide, another police car pulled up, lights flashing. Malcolm's stomach tightened as two more officers stepped out. He knew this wasn't over. Not yet. What's the situation? One of the new officers asked, approaching quickly. The first officer straightened, his voice regaining some of its authority. I was conducting a routine stop. There was a misunderstanding. Malcolm's voice cut through the explanation, sharp and unyielding. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like harassment. The new officer hesitated, glancing at the badge still visible in Malcolm's wallet. Sir, if we could just clear this up. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice ringing out loud enough for the crowd to hear. No, we're not clearing this up. Not here. You want to clear this up? We do it at the station. And when we get there, I'll be filing a formal complaint. The crowd stirred, voices rising in agreement. Malcolm didn't turn to look at them. His eyes stayed locked on the officers in front of him, daring them to make their next move. The first officer's face twisted, but Malcolm could see the defeat settling in his shoulders. He stepped back, motioning to the others. Let him go. The words hung in the air, heavy with resentment, but Malcolm didn't move right away. He waited, watching as the officer took another step back and the others followed suit. Only then did he lower his hands and step away from the car. Elijah moved to his side immediately. You okay? Malcolm nodded, but his eyes never left the officers. I'm fine. But this isn't over, and he meant it. Because as he looked at the faces of the officers, the crowd, and the neighbors still lingering behind their curtains, Malcolm knew this was bigger than just one incident. Bigger than just one officer. What came next wouldn't just be about clearing his name. It would be about exposing the truth, no matter what it cost. And as the officers retreated to their cars, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that the cost was about to be higher than anyone expected. Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on Officer Dawson, his chest rising and falling with steady but deliberate breaths. The air around them felt heavier now, thick with tension and the unspoken weight of what had just unfolded. The crowd hadn't dispersed. In fact, more people had gathered, their phones raised like shields, capturing every movement, every word. The pressure in the atmosphere was palpable, and Malcolm could feel it pressing down on everyone present, but no one more than Dawson. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his belt, his stance still firm but no longer commanding. He had been stripped of the power he once wore like armor, and Malcolm could see it, the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. Dawson opened his mouth, but his voice came out softer this time, almost hesitant. "Sir, I think we can," he caught himself, swallowing hard, like even he didn't believe what he was about to say. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink. He let the silence stretch out, suffocating and heavy, forcing Dawson to feel every ounce of the pressure Malcolm had felt since the moment their confrontation began. Dawson cleared his throat, trying again. "We can talk about this. There's no need to escalate the situation further." Malcolm's eyes sharpened, and his voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Escalate? You think I escalated this?" He took a step closer, his shoulders squared and his presence towering. "You pulled me out of my car, shoved me against it, and treated me like a criminal in front of an entire neighborhood. And now you have the nerve to talk to me about escalation?" The officer flinched, his body language shifting into something defensive but unsure. Malcolm didn't let up. "Tell me, officer, what exactly did you think you were doing when you stopped me? Protecting this neighborhood? Stopping a dangerous suspect? Or were you just doing what you've always done, targeting someone who didn't look like they belonged?" Dawson's jaw tightened, and Malcolm could see the anger and fear battling for dominance in his eyes. "I didn't know who you were exactly," Malcolm shot back. "You didn't know who I was, so you assumed. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't need to know me. All you needed was to see my skin and the car I was driving, and that was enough." The officer tried to speak, but Malcolm cut him off again, his voice rising now, not in anger but in conviction. "You thought you had the right to humiliate me. To violate my dignity. And why? Because you thought no one would question you. Because you thought you could get away with it." Dawson stepped back slightly, his eyes darting toward the crowd. Malcolm saw the fear deepen as more phones pointed in their direction, capturing every angle of his shame. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore, they were witnesses, and Dawson knew it. "Look, Dawson started, but Malcolm didn't let him finish. "No. You don't get to explain this away. Not this time." Malcolm stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure every word carried weight. "You don't get to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. Not with all these people watching. Not with me standing here." The officer swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between Malcolm and the phones pointed at him. He was cornered now, and Malcolm could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his breath hitched. Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice sharp and deliberate. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand me my wallet. And then you're going to apologize. Loud enough for everyone here to hear you." Dawson's eyes widened, and for a second, Malcolm thought he might refuse. But then his hands moved slowly to his belt, unclipping the wallet. He held it out, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'm sorry." Malcolm didn't move. Louder. The officer flinched, his face reddening as he glanced at the crowd, their phones still recording. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice louder this time but still strained. Malcolm reached out, taking the wallet without breaking eye contact. The silence that followed was deafening. He saw the shame burning in Dawson's eyes, but there was no satisfaction in it, only the weight of knowing this wasn't justice. It was only the first step. "Now get out of here," Malcolm said, his voice low and firm. "And don't think for a second that this is over." Dawson didn't argue. He turned, walking back toward his cruiser, and the other officers followed. The crowd parted for them but didn't stop recording, capturing every step until the last car disappeared around the corner. Only then did Malcolm release the breath he'd been holding. Elijah was at his side in an instant. "Malcolm, are you okay?" Malcolm nodded, his shoulders still tense. "I'm fine." Elijah looked at him, his eyes scanning for any sign of weakness, but Malcolm's expression stayed hard. "No, you're not." "That wasn't fine." Malcolm finally looked at him, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "It wasn't fine. But it's not over." Elijah's brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't just about me," Malcolm said, looking back at the crowd, at the faces still watching. It's about every single person who's been through what I just went through and didn't have a badge to pull out. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening. Elijah nodded slowly, his voice quieter now. So what do we do next? Malcolm's jaw tightened, and his eyes stayed locked on the empty street. We make sure he doesn't get away with it. We make sure he answers for what he did, and in that moment, Malcolm knew the real fight hadn't even started yet. The confrontation with Dawson was only the beginning. What came next would be bigger. Messier. And it wouldn't just be about clearing his own name, it would be about exposing the truth and forcing the system to reckon with itself. As he stood there, surrounded by the weight of what had just happened, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Malcolm stood there for a long moment, his heartbeat still heavy in his chest as the police cars disappeared around the corner. The crowd had begun to thin, but a few neighbors lingered, their eyes filled with something that hovered between curiosity and guilt. Elijah hadn't moved from his side, his phone still in his hand, though the screen had gone dark. Malcolm exhaled slowly, trying to loosen the knot of tension coiled in his shoulders, but it wasn't working. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on him, and he wasn't sure how to shake it. Elijah broke the silence first, his voice low but edged with frustration. You should have let me step in sooner. That guy had no right to. Malcolm cut him off, his voice sharper than he intended. No right? That's the whole point. He thought he had every right. And the worst part is, he probably still does. Elijah's eyes flashed, and he shoved his phone into his pocket. So what? You just let him walk away. You let him slink off like nothing happened. Malcolm turned to face him, his voice steady but full of fire. No, I let him walk away because that's not where this ends. This doesn't end with him driving off and pretending this never happened. It ends when he has to answer for it. When people like him can't hide behind a badge anymore. Elijah stared at him, his jaw tight. And you really think that's going to happen? You think this is going to be different? Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. It has to be. Elijah shook his head and looked away, his frustration still simmering. The crowd had mostly dispersed by now, but one woman lingered at the edge of the lawn, her phone still recording. Malcolm recognized her as one of the neighbors who had been watching earlier, her face tight with worry. She took a hesitant step closer. I saw everything. It was wrong, what they did to you. I'm sorry. Malcolm gave her a small nod, but his voice was firm. Don't be sorry. Be loud. Make sure people see what happened here. Her eyes darted to Elijah, then back to Malcolm, before she nodded. I'll share the video. People need to know. Malcolm nodded again, and she stepped back, finally lowering her phone. Elijah let out a breath, pacing slightly. This doesn't feel like enough. It's not enough. Malcolm ran a hand over his face. It's not supposed to feel like enough. But it's a start. Before Elijah could respond, Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the number, his supervisor. He hesitated for just a second before answering. Malcolm, the voice on the other end said, tight and controlled. I saw the video. It's spreading fast. Malcolm asked, his voice steady even as his pulse quickened. Fast doesn't cover it. The video is everywhere. People are already talking. Malcolm didn't know whether to feel relieved or unsettled. He looked at Elijah, whose eyes were glued to him, waiting for some sign of what was happening. What does that mean? Malcolm asked, his voice measured. It means you need to get ahead of this. There's going to be fallout. The department's already talking about an internal investigation. Malcolm's grip tightened around the phone. And Dawson? Suspended, his supervisor said. Effective immediately. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the word settle. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was movement. We're going to need a statement from you, the supervisor continued. Official, clean, and airtight. We can't leave any openings for them to turn this around on you. Malcolm's jaw clenched. I'll be there first thing in the morning. Good. And Malcolm? Be careful. This isn't over. The line went dead, and Malcolm lowered the phone, his mind already spinning. Elijah was watching him closely. Suspended? Elijah asked. Malcolm nodded. For now. Elijah crossed his arms. And what about later? What happens when the department starts closing ranks? What happens when he plays the victim? Malcolm's voice was quiet but firm. That's why we don't let this fade. We keep pushing until there's nowhere for him to hide. Elijah looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out and clapped Malcolm on the shoulder. You know I've got your back. Malcolm nodded, and for the first time since the confrontation started, he let himself feel a flicker of relief. But it was brief. He knew better than to let his guard down. The next morning, Malcolm stepped into the station, his badge clipped to his belt and his shoulders squared. The whispers started before he even reached the main desk. Eyes followed him, some filled with curiosity, others with suspicion. But he didn't stop. He walked straight to his supervisor's office and closed the door behind him. You're making waves, the supervisor said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. Good, Malcolm said. That's the point. The supervisor finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Are you sure you want to do this? You're putting yourself in the spotlight. Malcolm didn't hesitate. It's not about what I want. It's about what's right. The supervisor leaned back in his chair, studying him. And what if this doesn't go the way you want it to? Then it doesn't, Malcolm said. But at least I won't be the one who stayed quiet. The supervisor's gaze softened slightly, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he handed Malcolm a file. This is everything we have on Dawson. It's not pretty. Malcolm opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. Patterns emerged, complaints, warnings, incidents swept under the rug. And no one stopped him, Malcolm said, his voice low. Not until now, the supervisor replied. Malcolm closed the file and met his supervisor's eyes. Then let's make sure this time sticks. And with those words, Malcolm knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about Dawson anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had been building for far too long. And as he stepped out of the office, file in hand, he felt the weight of what came next settle over him. But he didn't flinch. He was ready. Malcolm sat at his desk, the weight of the file still heavy in his hands. The papers inside weren't just evidence, they were proof of a system that had allowed Officer Dawson to operate unchecked for years. Complaints from civilians, internal memos about excessive force, and quietly closed cases that painted a picture Malcolm couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of power. It was about how many people had looked the other way. How many had chosen silence instead of accountability. He flipped through the pages again, his eyes lingering on the statements from victims, stories that echoed his own experience. People who had been stopped, searched, humiliated, and then dismissed when they dared to speak up. Malcolm could almost hear their voices in the words written there, could feel the same anger and frustration simmering beneath the surface. And yet, none of them had been able to do what he was about to do. None of them had been in the position to fight back the way he could. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Elijah, his expression tense but determined. Malcolm gestured for him to come in, and Elijah shut the door behind him, lowering his voice. You're all over the news, man. This thing is bigger than you thought. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. That's exactly what I wanted. Yeah. Elijah stepped closer, dropping into the chair across from him. Because it also means the department's feeling the heat. I heard Dawson's already talking to lawyers. Malcolm didn't flinch. Of course he is. He's trying to save himself. Elijah leaned forward, his voice sharper now. And what if it works? What if he spins this into some kind of sob story about how he was just doing his job and made a mistake? People eat that stuff up. They'll talk about how hard his job is, how stressed he must have been, and suddenly he's the victim. You know how this works. Malcolm's jaw tightened. That's why we keep the pressure on. We make sure people see the truth before he gets the chance to rewrite it. Elijah shook his head, his frustration clear. And what if the truth isn't enough? What if they bury this like they always do? Then we dig it back up, Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm. We don't stop. We don't let it fade. Elijah sat back, exhaling sharply. And what about you? What happens when they start coming after you? Because you know they will. They'll look for dirt, twist things, make you the bad guy. Are you ready for that? Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. I have to be. Elijah didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. Look, I know you want to do the right thing. But I also know you're not invincible. Don't let this thing destroy you while you're trying to fix it. Malcolm's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. I can handle it. Elijah stood, pacing the small office before stopping at the window. You're not the only one this affects. You get that, right? People are watching you. People are hoping you'll win this fight because they're too scared to fight it themselves. But if you lose, I won't lose, Malcolm said, cutting him off. Because this isn't just about me. It never was. The room fell silent, but the weight of Elijah's words lingered. Malcolm knew the risks, he'd thought about them more times than he could count. But he also knew what was at stake if he backed down now. Later that evening, Malcolm found himself standing outside his apartment, his phone buzzing non-stop with messages and notifications. Reporters had already started reaching out, asking for statements, interviews, reactions to Dawson's suspension. He ignored most of them, letting their calls go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to speak publicly yet, not until he had a clear plan. The sound of footsteps pulled his attention, and he turned to see Dawson standing at the edge of the parking lot. Malcolm's entire body tensed, but he didn't move. Dawson looked different now, smaller, less certain. His clothes were wrinkled, and his face was drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. We need to talk, Dawson said, his voice quieter than Malcolm had ever heard it. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He studied Dawson, searching for any sign of the man who had shoved him against his car just days earlier. But what he saw instead was fear. Not anger, not defiance, fear. You've got some nerve showing up here, Malcolm finally said, his voice low. Dawson took a step closer, but he stopped when Malcolm didn't move. I need you to hear me out. Malcolm crossed his arms, keeping his posture rigid. You want me to hear you out? After what you did? After how you treated me? Dawson flinched, but he didn't back away. I know I screwed up. I know I crossed a line. But you don't understand what's happening. They're throwing me under the bus. They're using me to take the heat off themselves. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. And I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? No, Dawson said quickly. I'm not asking for that. I need your help. Malcolm let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. My help? Are you kidding me? Dawson's voice cracked. They're digging into my record. They're looking for anything they can use to make me the scapegoat. If this goes the way it's headed, I lose everything. My job, my pension, my family. Everything. Malcolm's expression hardened. And how many people did you make feel that exact same way? How many people lost everything because of you? Dawson's shoulders sagged. I can't fix what I've done. I know that. But if they take me down, they're just going to replace me with someone worse. Someone who'll do the same thing, but smarter. I know things, Malcolm. About the department. About the people running it. But if I go down alone, none of that comes out. Malcolm's heart pounded as he processed Dawson's words. He wanted to dismiss them, to walk away and let Dawson face the consequences of his actions. But deep down, he knew the officer wasn't lying. And that truth left Malcolm standing at the edge of a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Malcolm didn't move. He stayed rooted in place, his arms crossed tightly as he stared at Dawson. The man looked smaller than he had days ago, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously as if he expected Malcolm to lash out at any second. But Malcolm didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice or let the anger bubbling beneath his skin explode. Instead, he let the silence hang between them, thick and heavy, until Dawson shifted uncomfortably and spoke again. "I know I don't deserve your help. I know I'm the last person you should even want to talk to right now. But you need to understand that if I go down, it's not just me. They're going to bury the truth with me. They'll make me the villain and pretend the system is clean. But you and I both know that's a lie." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his voice sharp when he finally spoke. "You want me to save you? After what you did? After how you treated me, you think I owe you something?" Dawson flinched, and his voice cracked when he answered. "No. I don't think you owe me anything. But I think you want the truth to come out. I think you want this to mean something." Malcolm took a step closer, his eyes locked on Dawson's. "You don't get to stand here and act like you suddenly care about the truth. You didn't care when you slammed me against my car. You didn't care when you looked me in the eye and treated me like I didn't belong. The only reason you're here now is because you're scared." Dawson swallowed hard, his voice quieter but no less desperate. "You're right. I am scared. But not just for me. I'm scared of what happens if people like me keep getting away with this. If nothing changes. If I'm just replaced by someone else who's better at covering their tracks. I can't fix what I did to you. I can't take it back. But I can make this count for something more." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He let Dawson's words sink in, searching the man's face for any sign of manipulation or dishonesty. But all he saw was desperation, the kind that came from someone who knew he was losing everything and didn't know how to stop it. Malcolm hated how much he wanted to believe him. "You want me to trust you," Malcolm said finally, his voice steady. "You think I'm supposed to believe that you suddenly care about doing the right thing?" Dawson's voice was raw. "I don't expect you to trust me. But I'm telling you the truth. I have files, documents, emails. Evidence of cover-ups, illegal stops, planted evidence. Things that could take down more than just me. But if I go down without your help, none of it comes out." Malcolm's pulse quickened. He wanted to walk away, to leave Dawson to deal with the mess he had made. But he couldn't ignore the weight of the words hanging between them. This wasn't just about Dawson anymore. It was bigger than that. "If you have evidence," Malcolm said, his voice sharp, "then prove it. Show me." Dawson reached into his jacket, moving slowly enough that Malcolm's instincts didn't kick in, and pulled out a flash drive. It was small, plain, the kind anyone could buy at a convenience store. He held it out, his hand trembling. "Everything's on here. Copies of reports, emails, even audio recordings. Enough to bring down the people protecting me." Malcolm didn't take it right away. He stared at it, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he took it, he knew there was no turning back. This wouldn't just be about exposing Dawson. It would be about exposing an entire system, and he would be stepping straight into the line of fire. "You want me to take this and trust that it's real? That it's not just your last-ditch effort to save yourself?" Dawson's voice cracked. "I swear it's real. Look through it, and you'll see for yourself." Malcolm finally reached out and took the drive, feeling the smooth plastic against his palm. Dawson exhaled in relief, but Malcolm wasn't done. "If this is a lie, if this is some kind of game, I'll make sure you don't just lose your badge. I'll make sure you lose everything." Dawson nodded quickly. "It's not a lie. You'll see." Malcolm's grip tightened around the drive as he stepped back. Elijah was waiting just inside the building, his arms crossed as he watched the exchange through the glass doors. When Malcolm stepped inside, Elijah's eyes immediately dropped to the flash drive. "What the hell is that?" Elijah's voice was sharp, his expression filled with suspicion. Evidence, Malcolm said, his voice flat. Or at least that's what he says it is. Elijah's eyebrows shot up. And you believe him? After everything he's done? I don't believe him, Malcolm said quickly. But I believe in facts. And if this thing has what he says it does, we can't ignore it. Elijah ran a hand over his face, his frustration clear. You know what's going to happen, right? The second you use this, you're making enemies out of people who have the power to destroy you. This doesn't end with Dawson. It doesn't stop at him. Malcolm's voice was steady. It's not supposed to stop with him. Elijah shook his head, but there was no more fight in his voice. Just be careful. I mean it. Malcolm sat down at his desk, plugging the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered as folders appeared, each one labeled with dates and case numbers. He clicked on the first folder, and his stomach dropped as he scanned the files inside. Emails detailing altered reports. Audio recordings of officers laughing about planting evidence. Photos of staged crime scenes. Elijah leaned over his shoulder, his voice low. Jesus. Malcolm didn't look away from the screen. This isn't just him. It's bigger than him. Elijah's voice was sharp. So what do we do now? Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on the evidence in front of him, his voice calm but filled with determination. We burn it down. All of it. And as the weight of those words settled in the room, Malcolm knew there was no going back. The fight wasn't just about Dawson anymore. It was about exposing the rot that had been allowed to grow for too long. And no matter what it cost, Malcolm was ready to see it through. Malcolm stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the rows of files as the weight of what he had just uncovered pressed harder against his chest. The silence in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the computer. Elijah hovered behind him, his breath shallow as his eyes darted between the folders and Malcolm's tense expression. Malcolm clicked on another folder, and a series of audio recordings popped up. He hesitated before pressing play, his stomach tightening as static filled the speakers, followed by voices that made his skin crawl. You planted under the seat? A voice asked, casual, almost bored. Yeah, the second he stepped out, another voice replied. Rookie didn't even check. Signed the damn report without reading it. Malcolm clenched his jaw as Elijah took a sharp breath behind him. Malcolm clicked on another file, this one labeled, Internal Memo. It was worse than he expected, lists of complaints marked as, resolved, with no details, officers being transferred instead of investigated, and handwritten notes that made it clear Dawson wasn't acting alone. This is bigger than we thought, Elijah said, his voice low but filled with disbelief. This isn't just Dawson. It's a system. They've been covering for each other. Malcolm closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests like he was trying to ground himself. He had known it was bad, but seeing the evidence laid out like this made it feel heavier, more real. Elijah leaned against the desk, crossing his arms as his voice softened. So what do we do now? Malcolm's voice was steady, but his words felt heavier than before. We can't let this stay buried. We have to release it. Elijah's eyes widened. Release it? Do you have any idea what's going to happen if we do that? This isn't just one guy planting evidence. This is the whole department. They're not going to sit back and let us take them down. Malcolm met his eyes. I know that. But we don't have a choice. If we let this go, it keeps happening. People like Dawson keep getting away with it. Elijah's voice rose, frustration spilling out. And what about you? Do you even realize what they'll do to you? They'll come after your job, your reputation, hell, they'll probably come after your family. You're talking about blowing up the whole system, Malcolm. That's not something you walk away from. Malcolm didn't flinch. I'm not trying to walk away. Elijah stared at him, his eyes searching for something, hesitation, doubt, anything that might make him think Malcolm wasn't serious. But he didn't find it. Instead, Malcolm's expression hardened, his voice quieter but no less intense. You don't get it, Malcolm said. This isn't about me. It never was. It's about every person who's been stopped and searched for no reason. Every person who's been humiliated, arrested, and locked up because someone like Dawson decided they could get away with it. I can't just let that go. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, pacing as he tried to process what Malcolm was saying. And what if it's not enough? What if you release this and it doesn't change anything? What if they spin it and make you look like the bad guy? Malcolm's voice sharpened. Then at least I tried. At least I didn't let it keep happening. Elijah stopped pacing, his shoulders dropping slightly. He looked at Malcolm for a long moment before finally speaking again. You're serious about this? Malcolm didn't hesitate. Dead serious. Elijah let out a breath, his voice quieter now. Then I guess I'm in. But we have to be smart about this. We can't just drop this and hope for the best. We need to control the narrative. We need to make sure they can't spin this. Malcolm nodded, his mind already racing through the steps they needed to take. We'll leak it to the press first. The recordings, the memos, everything. Once it's out there, they can't contain it. And Dawson? Elijah asked, his voice wary. Malcolm hesitated, but only for a moment. He'll have to answer for his part in this. But if he's telling the truth about what he knows, we'll use it. He's not walking away from this clean, but he might help us take down the rest. Elijah shook his head, his voice low. This is insane. No, Malcolm said, his voice sharp. What's insane is letting this go. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of silence. It was heavy, deliberate, a silence filled with purpose. Malcolm turned back to the computer, copying the files onto another drive as Elijah paced behind him. You know they're going to come after you, Elijah said finally. Malcolm's voice didn't waver. Let them. Elijah stared at him, but there was no more doubt in his eyes. Instead, there was something else, respect. He nodded once before grabbing his phone. I'll start reaching out to reporters. Just say the word when you're ready. Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on the screen as the files finished copying. We're ready. Hours later, Malcolm sat in his apartment, his phone buzzing non-stop as emails and texts poured in from reporters and news outlets. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on the files still open on his laptop. He had spent the last few hours double-checking everything, making sure there were no gaps, no openings for anyone to discredit the evidence. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He stood cautiously, peering through the peephole before opening it to find Dawson standing there again, his face pale and drawn. What are you doing here? Malcolm asked, his voice sharp. Dawson stepped inside, his hands trembling. I heard. The files, they're out, aren't they? Malcolm didn't answer. Dawson let out a shaky breath, his voice breaking. Do you have any idea what's about to happen? Malcolm's voice was cold. Yeah. I do. Dawson's eyes filled with panic. They're going to come after me. You have to help me. You said you'd help. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I said I'd use what you gave me. That doesn't mean I'm protecting you. Dawson's voice cracked. I gave you everything. Everything I had. They're going to destroy me for this. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low but firm. And how many people did you destroy before this? How many people did you leave with nothing? Dawson swallowed hard, but Malcolm didn't give him time to answer. You're scared? Good. You should be. Because this time, you don't get to walk away clean. And as Dawson's shoulders sagged, Malcolm turned back toward his laptop, his pulse steady. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. Malcolm sat in the courtroom, his shoulders squared and his gaze steady as Dawson was led to the defendant's table. The room buzzed with tension, reporters lined the back wall, their cameras clicking as Dawson avoided their stares. Malcolm felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but it wasn't fear or doubt that filled him. It was resolve. The kind of resolve that had carried him through every step of this fight, even when the odds felt stacked against him. Today wasn't just about Dawson. It was about every name in those files, every victim who had been silenced, and every person who had been too afraid to speak up. This was justice finally taking its shape. Dawson's lawyer stood and tried to paint him as a man under pressure, a man who had simply made poor decisions in a broken system, but the evidence was overwhelming. The emails, the audio recordings, the internal memos, they spoke louder than any defense could. Malcolm watched Dawson's shoulders sag lower with each piece of evidence presented. He saw the moment Dawson realized there was no escape, no plea deal that could save him from what was coming. And yet, Malcolm didn't feel satisfaction watching him unravel. What he felt instead was something deeper, a sense of responsibility, of duty to make sure this moment meant something. When Malcolm took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was calm, measured, but every word carried weight. He spoke about the patterns he had uncovered, the system that had protected men like Dawson, and the consequences for those who had suffered because of it. He didn't flinch when Dawson's lawyer tried to discredit him, didn't let the attempts to spin the narrative shake his resolve. By the time he stepped down, Malcolm could see it in the faces around him, the tide had turned. The truth was out, and there was no pulling it back. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. Dawson's face drained of color, his eyes wide and unblinking as the judge listed the charges and the sentences attached to them. Malcolm didn't look away. He needed to see it through to the end. When Dawson was escorted out, Malcolm let out a slow breath. It was over. At least this part of it was. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones shoved toward Malcolm as questions flew. He paused, raising a hand to quiet them. The words he chose were careful but firm. This wasn't just about one man. It was about accountability. About making sure those who abuse their power are held responsible. And it's about the people who stood up, who refused to let fear keep them silent. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with moments like this. Later that night, Malcolm stood in his apartment, looking out the window at the city lights. The phone on the table buzzed with messages, emails, and calls he hadn't answered yet. He'd spent so long fighting this battle that he hadn't given himself time to think about what came next. He knew the work wasn't finished. The files had exposed more than Dawson, they had cracked open a system that needed more than one trial to fix. But for the first time in weeks, Malcolm let himself breathe. Elijah showed up at the door, carrying 2 beers and a grin that said more than words could. Malcolm let him in, and they sat in the living room, the weight of the day slowly lifting. Elijah leaned back, shaking his head. I still can't believe it. You actually did it. Malcolm looked over at him, his voice quieter than usual. We did it. Elijah took a sip of his beer before pointing at him. Don't get all humble on me now. This was you. You didn't let up, even when I told you to walk away. That's what made the difference. Malcolm let out a small laugh, but there was no arrogance in it. He knew the fight wasn't over. He knew there would be backlash, pushback, and attempts to rebuild the walls he had just torn down. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for it. And Dawson? He wouldn't be walking away clean. The evidence he provided had helped push the investigation further, exposing deeper levels of corruption, but it hadn't absolved him. He would face years behind bars, and no amount of regret or desperation could change that. Malcolm had made sure of it. But what lingered in his mind wasn't Dawson's fall, it was the people who had enabled him, the ones who had looked the other way for years. They were next. Malcolm stood and looked out the window again, his reflection staring back at him. He didn't see the man who had been humiliated that day in the street anymore. He saw the man who had fought back, who had refused to let fear or anger define him. And he knew that fight wasn't over. This story isn't just about Malcolm or Dawson. It's about what happens when power is abused, when systems fail, and when people choose silence instead of accountability. But it's also about courage. About the strength it takes to stand up, to speak out, and to demand change even when the odds are stacked against you. Malcolm's story reminds us that justice isn't always immediate, but it's possible if we refuse to give up. So now it's your turn. What would you have done in Malcolm's place? Would you have taken the risk, exposed the truth, and faced the consequences? Or would you have walked away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice, and if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the world we live in and the changes we need to make, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel Tales of Twist, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next twist.